Ken Jennings walked into a Los Angeles television studio in 2004 as an anonymous software engineer from Utah, and he walked out 74 games later as one of the most recognizable faces on American television. Somewhere between those two moments, an ordinary man's life was rewritten by trivia, and the story of what happened next is far stranger and more human than most people realize. Before the cameras and the winning streak, Jennings was living a life that could not have looked more ordinary. He had grown up partly overseas, the son of an attorney whose work took the family to Singapore and South Korea, before he eventually settled into life in the American West. He studied computer science and English at Brigham Young University, married, had children, and worked a steady job as a software engineer in Salt Lake City. Trivia was a hobby, not a career plan. He liked knowing things, the way some people like running or woodworking, and when he decided to try out for Jeopardy, it was less a bid for stardom than a lark, a chance to test himself against a game he had watched and admired for years. Nothing about his background suggested that he was about to become a cultural phenomenon. Then came the summer of 2004. Jennings won his first game, then his second, then kept winning to the fall, night after night, until the improbable became the impossible and the impossible became routine. Viewers who tuned in expecting a single episode found themselves tracking a streak that seemed to defy the laws of television and probability alike. He did not just answer questions correctly. He did with a kind of quiet, self-deprecating charm that made him easy to root for, a mix of nerdy enthusiasm and calm nerve that read as neither arrogant nor accidental. Behind the scenes, his game relied on real strategy as much as raw recall. He mastered the mechanics of the buzzer, moved across the board in unconventional patterns designed to keep opponents off balance, and made calculated wagers that reflected a sharp understanding of probability and risk. It was showmanship built on substance. By the time the streak ended, Jennings had won 74 consecutive games, falling just short of a 75th victory to a challenger named Nancy Zerg. His total winnings from that historic run came to roughly $2.5 million, an amount that instantly reordered his financial life and, just as quickly, reordered his public identity. He was no longer a software engineer who liked trivia. He was the Jeopardy guy, a shorthand that would follow him for the rest of his life, for better and for worse. The record he set that year has never been broken, and in the 2 decades since, only a handful of contestants have even approached it, which has only cemented the sense that what he did in 2004 was a singular, once-in-a-generation feat. What followed the streak, though, was not a simple victory lap. Sudden fame of that scale is disorienting for almost anyone who experiences it, and Jennings was no exception. He was thrust from a private, fairly conventional life into a version of celebrity that came with talk show bookings, magazine profiles, and a level of public scrutiny that trivia contestants had never really faced before. Journalists wanted to know not just how he memorized so many facts, but who he was as a person, what his marriage was like, what his religious beliefs meant to him, how he spent his free time. The curiosity extended well past the game board, into the kind of personal territory that a formerly private person is rarely prepared to have picked apart in public. Online forums and the earliest wave of social chatter turned him into something people debated as much as admired, with some fans embracing him as a lovable everyman genius, and others questioning whether his success was somehow unfair, simply because it was so far outside the norm. That tension between admiration and suspicion is a common cause of unexpected fame, especially for someone whose public identity was built entirely on being smart rather than on the usual currencies of celebrity like looks, music, or acting. Jennings had to learn, in real time and under spotlight, how to manage a public image he had never asked to construct. He did so largely by leaning into humility rather than performance, crediting hard work and preparation instead of claiming to be some kind of savant, which had the effect of making him more relatable even as his life became less and less normal. Still, the adjustment was real. He has spoken candidly in later interviews about how strange and occasionally stressful it was to have ordinary interactions become fodder for public comment, and about the effort it took to protect some sense of privacy for himself and his family, while still fulfilling the role the public now expected him to play. The bigger challenge came after the cameras stopped rolling on the streak itself, figuring out what a career actually looks like for a former quiz show champion. Trivia fame is a strange kind of fame. It does not come with an obvious next step the way winning an Olympic medal or starring in a hit film might. Jennings tried several paths in the years that followed. He wrote books, starting with Brainiac, a memoir and meditation on quiz culture that let him process his own experience in his own words rather than to filter press coverage. He followed it with other nonfiction work exploring trivia, maps, and the strange psychology of people who love facts for their own sake. Writing gave him something hosting appearances could not: control over his own narrative and a way to be taken seriously as a thinker rather than simply as a game show curiosity. He also moved into digital media before it was a conventional career path for someone with his background, hosting podcasts and building an online presence centered on trivia and curiosity rather than celebrity gossip. He took on hosting and consulting roles for other trivia formats, lending his expertise to projects that wanted the credibility his name carried. Along the way, he was candid about the limits of that kind of career. Trivia fame, he acknowledged, does not translate into the same range of mainstream opportunities available to actors or musicians, and there was a real risk of becoming a one-note figure defined forever by a single achievement from 2 decades earlier. Rather than chase every opportunity that came his way, he was selective, avoiding the kind of overexposure that can turn a respected public figure into a punchline. That restraint, more than any single career move, is probably what kept him relevant long after most quiz show champions fade from public memory. The turning point that redefined his public life a second time came from tragedy rather than triumph. In November 2020, Alex Trebek, the host who had presided over Jeopardy for more than 3 decades and had become as central to its identity as the show itself, died after a long battle with pancreatic cancer. The loss left production searching for a way forward with no obvious answer. Jennings, who had already been working as a consultant producer on the show, was tapped as the first in a rotating series of guest hosts brought in to fill Trebek's chair while the network figured out its next move. It was an emotionally fraught assignment. Jennings was stepping into a role inseparable from a man the show's staff and audience were still mourning, and he later admitted that the early days of hosting felt more frightening than triumphant, precisely because the moment was about loss as much as opportunity. What followed was a genuinely messy transition for the show. Several guest hosts rotated through over the following months, including television and film personalities from outside the trivia world, none of whom the audience fully embraced. A permanent hosting decision briefly landed on Mike Richards, the show's own executive producer at the time, only for that plan to collapse within days after a series of past offensive remarks he had made resurface publicly, forcing him to step down from both the hosting role and his producing job. In the aftermath, the show settled into a temporary arrangement, splitting hosting duties between Jennings and actress Mayim Bialik, with Jennings covering the daily syndicated episodes and Bialik taking on primetime specials and spin-offs. That arrangement continued for roughly 2 years, an unusually long stretch of uncertainty for a franchise that had built decades of stability around a single host. By 2023, the show made its choice clear. Bialik departed from the hosting role, and Jennings became the sole host of the syndicated series, a position that finally gave him and the show some measure of settled identity again. His hosting style drew praise for balancing reverence for Trebek's legacy with his own more playful, occasionally self-aware sensibility, an approach that read as neither an imitation of his predecessor nor rejection of the show's traditions. He received an Emmy nomination for his hosting work, a formal acknowledgement that his transition from champion to host had actually succeeded rather than merely survived. In the years since, he has continued hosting essentially every version of the show apart from a streaming-only spin-off fronted by a different personality, and network leadership has spoken about him not as a placeholder, but as a long-term fixture, openly comparing his tenure to the decades-long run Trebek himself enjoyed. None of that stability erased the personal toll the years in between had taken. Jennings has talked openly, more so than most game show figures before him, about the pressure of being a public symbol of intelligence, while also being an ordinary person with normal doubts and limitations. He has described the importance of drawing boundaries between his public role and his private life, and of leaning on family for perspective during periods when public attention felt overwhelming. That willingness to acknowledge difficulty, rather than perform effortless success, has become part of what makes his story resonate. It reframes his arc not as an uninterrupted rise from champion to host, but as a longer, more complicated process of figuring out who he wanted to be once the cameras that made him famous were no longer guaranteed to keep pointing his way. Beyond his own career, Jennings' influence on trivia and quiz culture more broadly is hard to overstate. His 2004 run helped turn a decades-old game show into appointment viewing again, sparking renewed public interest in trivia as both entertainment and a legitimate intellectual pursuit. In the years since, a wider culture of pub quizzes, trivia apps, and online trivia communities has flourished, and while Jennings did not create that world single-handedly, he is routinely cited as one of its most visible ambassadors. He helped popularize an image of intelligence as something approachable rather than intimidating, a corrective to the old stereotype of trivia obsessives as socially awkward outliers. By discussing his own preparation and strategy candidly in books, interviews, and podcasts, he also gave audiences a rare look at the actual mechanics behind expert-level recall and quick thinking, turning what once looked like magic into something recognizable as skill built through discipline and curiosity. Today, Jennings occupies a position that would have been hard to predict back in 2004. Not just a record holder remembered for a single extraordinary summer, but the presiding figure of the very show that made him famous. He has spoken about having no plans to step away from hosting anytime soon, telling interviewers that traditionally it is not the kind of job people retire from, and network executives have echoed that sentiment, describing him as increasingly essential to the show's identity the longer he stays in the chair. It is a strikingly different position from the one he occupied as a young contestant, uncertain what a life after Jeopardy might even look like. What really happened to Ken Jennings, in the end, is less a cautionary tale than a study in reinvention. A quiet trivia enthusiast became an overnight sensation, then had to learn how to live inside that sensation without losing himself. He tried writing, digital media, and consulting work to build a life that did not depend entirely on nostalgia for one unforgettable year. When tragedy reshaped the show that had made him famous, he stepped into an uncertain, emotionally difficult role and helped steady it, eventually earning the position on his own terms rather than simply inheriting it. His story suggests that the hardest part of extraordinary success is rarely the achievement itself, but everything that has to be figured out afterward, when the studio lights come up and an ordinary person is left to decide who they want to become next.